and ordered me to saddle his horse as quick as I could, and that Mr. Mainwaring had been murdered, and he'd got to go to town." "At what time was this?" "About 7:30, I should say." "Did he state his errand?" "No, sir." "When did he return?" "I saw his horse standing in the yard outside the stables about half an hour later, and then 'twas gone, and I didn't see it again till noon." Walter LaGrange was next called. He stated that he had spent the greater part of the day preceding the murder away from Fair Oaks. He had not been at home to luncheon or dinner, and consequently knew nothing of the strangers seen on the place that day. He had returned about 10:30 that evening, and remembered seeing Mr. Mainwaring and his guests seated on the veranda, but he had gone directly to his room without meeting any one. The first intimation which he had received of any unusual occurrence the next morning was when his mother entered his room and told him that Mr. Mainwaring had either been murdered or had committed suicide, no one knew which. "Was that her only object in coming to your room?" "No, sir. She wanted me to do an errand for her." "Will you state the nature of this errand?" "It was only to deliver a note." "To whom?" "To Mr. Hobson," the young man answered weakly, while his mother frowned, the first sign of emotion of any kind which she had betrayed that day. "Did you deliver the note?" "Yes, sir." "Then, under your mother's orders, you went to the city on your second trip, did you not?" "Yes, sir." "Were you successful in finding Mr. Hobson there?" "Yes, sir," the witness answered sullenly. "You had other business in the city aside from meeting him, had you not?" Between the coroner's persistence and his mother's visible signs of displeasure, Walter LaGrange was fast losing his temper. "If you know so much about this business, I don't see the use of your questioning me," he retorted angrily. "It is no affair of mine, anyway. I had nothing to do with it, nor I won't be mixed up in it, and if you want any information you'd better ask Mother for it. It's her business and none of mine." After a few more questions, which the witness answered sullenly and in monosyllables, he was dismissed. "Mr. Higgenbotham," announced the coroner. The greatest surprise was manifested on every side as the senior member of a well-known firm of jewelers stepped forward, the same gentleman who had accompanied Mr. Whitney on his return from the city on the preceding day. "Mr. Higgenbotham," said the coroner, "I believe you are able to furnish some testimony which will be pertinent at this time." "Yes, Dr. Westlake," responded the other, in deep musical tones. "I think possibly I can render you a little assistance in your investigations. Mr. Higgenbotham, do you recognize the young gentleman who has just given his testimony?" "I do, sir," said the witness, adjusting a pair of eyeglasses and gazing steadily at Walter LaGrange. "I recall his features perfectly." "You were personally acquainted with the late Hugh Mainwaring, I believe?" "Yes, sir, intimately acquainted with him." "You are, I believe, familiar with the Mainwaring jewels which are now missing?" continued the coroner. Walter LaGrange looked uncomfortable, and his mother's cheek paled. "I am, sir, having had them repeatedly left in my possession for safe keeping during their owner's absence from home, and I have also a complete list of them, with a detailed description of every piece." "Very well, Mr. Higgenbotham. Will you please state when and under what circumstances you saw this young gentleman?" "I was seated in my private office yesterday morning when my head clerk came in and asked me to step out into the salesrooms for a moment, as he said a young man was there trying to sell some very fine jewels, and from his youth and ignorance of their value he feared something was wrong. I went out immediately and saw this young gentleman, who handed me for inspection a superb diamond brooch and an elegant necklace of diamonds and pearls. I instantly recognized the gems as pieces from the old Mainwaring collection of jewels. Simultaneously there occurred to my mind the report of the murder of Hugh Mainwaring, which I had heard but a short time before, although then I knew nothing of the robbery. Naturally, my suspicions were awakened. I questioned the young man closely, however, and he stated that his home was at Fair Oaks, and that his mother was a distant relative of Mr. Mainwaring's, that the jewels were hers, and she wished to dispose of them for ready cash to meet an emergency. His story was so plausible that I thought possibly my suspicions had been somewhat hasty and premature. Still, I declined to purchase the jewels, and when he left the store, I ordered one of our private detectives to follow him and report to me. In the course of an hour, the detective returned and reported that the young men had sold the jewels to a pawnbroker for less than one-fourth their actual value. About half an hour later I heard the news of the robbery at Fair Oaks, and that the family jewels were missing. And knowing that Mr. Whitney was here, I immediately telephoned to him the facts which I have just stated. He came into the city at once and we proceeded to the pawnshop, where he also identified the jewels." Mr. Higginbotham paused for a moment, producing a packet from an inner pocket, which he proceeded to open. "We secured a loan of the jewels for a few days," he continued, advancing towards the coroner. "Here they are, and here is a copy of the list of which I spoke. By comparing these gems with the description of those which I have checked on the list, you will see that they are identical." He placed the open casket on the table. There was a moment's silence, broken by subdued exclamations of admiration as Dr. Westlake lifted the gems from their resting place. "You are correct," he said. "The description is complete. There is no doubt that these are a part of the collection. I see you have marked the value of these two items as $7,000. "Yes, that is a moderate valuation, and were the prices of the other articles carried out, you would see that, with the exception of a very few small pieces, these have the least value of the entire lot. I believe I can be of no further service." Mrs. LaGrange was next recalled. "Have you anything to say in reference to the testimony just given?" the coroner inquired. "I have this much to say," she replied haughtily, "that I could have given you the history of those jewels, including perhaps some facts of which even Mr. Higginbotham and Mr. Whitney are in ignorance, and have thus spared you the infinite pains you have taken to make public the straits to which I was reduced, because of my position here when in need of a little ready money. I could have informed you that they were originally a part of the old Mainwaring collection of gems until they were given me by my husband." "It hardly seems consistent that a man who treated his wife in the manner in which you claim to have been treated would bestow upon her gifts of such value as these," the coroner remarked with emphasis. "They were of little value to him," she answered with scorn. "As you have been informed, they were the poorest which he possessed. Besides, there were times when I could persuade him to almost anything but to acknowledge his lawful wife and his legitimate son." "Was the money which you were forced to raise by the sale of these jewels to be paid to Hobson?" "It was." "In accordance with the terms of your contract with him, made a few hours preceding the death of Mr. Mainwaring?" "Yes," she replied defiantly. "And as you probably would ask the nature of that contract, I will save you the trouble. Knowing that my son and I were likely to be defrauded of our rights in the same manner in which Hugh Mainwaring had defrauded others, I engaged Mr. Hobson as my attorney, as he, better than anyone else, knew the facts of the case. When I learned yesterday morning of my husband's death, I realized that I would have immediate need of his services, and accordingly sent him word to that effect. He demanded a large cash payment at once. The result of this demand Mr. Higginbotham has already told you." "How was Hobson to secure for you your rights from Hugh Mainwaring?" "That was left entirely to his own discretion." "Will you describe the appearance of Mr. Hobson's clerk?" "Unfortunately, I am unable to do so. He was merely brought as a witness to our contract. I knew that he was present, but he remained in the shadow, and I took no notice of him whatever." "Your contract, then, was a verbal one?" "It was." Upon being closely questioned, Mrs. LaGrange reiterated her assertions of the preceding day, laying particular stress upon the alleged interview between Hugh Mainwaring and his secretary, after which she was dismissed, and Harry Scott was recalled. "Mr. Scott," said the coroner, "what were the relations existing between Mr. Mainwaring and yourself up to the time of his death?" Scott flushed slightly as he replied, "Those ordinarily existing between employer and employed, except that I believe Mr. Mainwaring accorded me more than usual consideration, and I, while duly appreciative of his kindness, yet took especial pains never to exceed the bounds of an employee." "Were there ever any unpleasant words passed between you?" "None whatever." "Was your last interview with Mr. Mainwaring of a friendly nature?" "Entirely so." "What have you to say in reference to the testimony given to the effect that your voice was heard and recognized in angry conversation with Mr. Mainwaring at nearly 1 o'clock?" "I have to say that it is false and without foundation." "Do you mean to say that the statement of the witness was wholly without truth?" "I do not deny that such an interview, as alleged by the witness, may have taken place, for that is something concerning which I have no knowledge whatever, but I do deny that she heard my voice, or that I was in the library at that time, or at any time after about 20 minutes past 12. "Was that the time at which you went to your room?" "Very near that time, as my interview with Mr. Mainwaring could not have exceeded 10 minutes." "At what time did you retire?" "I sat up very late that night, for my mind was so occupied with some personal matters that I felt no inclination for sleep.